You live in Danville now?
Yeah, Danville and Roanoke.
Okay.
Either
you're
or.
splitting your time a little bit?
Yeah.
All right. Did you see the Washington Post today?
No.
There's an editorial about Danville today. I'll mention it
No
to you.
way.
Please get our fourth quarter because we have plenty of sandwiches. Welcome. My name is Sue Perdue. I'm the Director of Grants and Fellowships here at Virginia Humanities, and we're very pleased to have you all here for today's talk. The Public Humanities program has been going on for 2 years, and this is the culmination of the 23-24 class, and I'm very pleased to present to you the Dixon. So Ina is a familiar face to all of us at Virginia Humanities because she was the project manager for a project we had at Danville called History United from 2014 to 2017. Then she left and went on to get her doctorate at UNC Chapel Hill in American Studies. And like most North Carolinians, we get them back here in Virginia. A lot of our staff hails from North Carolina. And yes, shout out to North Carolina. And her dissertation topic was actually on the Danville Mills and this community of Schoolfield, which is the mill village in Danville that she'll talk about today. And the talk today is called A Dan River Fabric, the Life and Legacy of the Schoolfield Community. I told Ina something she didn't know today, which was that the Washington Post had an editorial about Danville, in which the editorial is called "Virginia City Burdened by History Seeks a Better Future." It was a great editorial. I'm going to share that with her. But I thought one of the things that the writer, Theodore Johnson, said is kind of a good launching point for Ina's talk, and that is, quote, "Danville has always hosted the nation's biggest questions about race and capitalism and democracy." So without further ado, Ina, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thanks for those who are tuning in at home.
I'm so excited to present a little bit of historical background about my project that I've been working on as a public humanities fellow. And give you some historical background, but also discuss really the reasoning behind this project, which includes a digital and physical exhibit that centers around the history of Dan River Mills, a major textile corporation in Danville, Virginia, and its company town of Schoolfield. So the vision behind that exhibit and sort of its progress. And I did change the name a little bit of this talk to include the future, because that's really what this exhibit is about. It's about designing something that offers a historical narrative so that we can reimagine our future together. And this is really critical in Danville. So, let's see. I did my dissertation on Dan River Mills, and that was a textile company that started in Danville in 1882. But Danville was really known for its role as a tobacco market, and that was really in the 1790s. We have a gentleman here in the audience who used to work for Dibble, one of the biggest tobacco companies in Danville. So Danville was really known for that. They have a radio station there called WBTM, which stands for World's Best Tobacco Market or World's Biggest Textile Mill, because they did have one of the largest textile mills in the South. So Danville became known as a tobacco market in the 1790s, and it grew up that way before the Civil War. And that's important to know because demographically that meant that they relied a lot on enslaved labor. So that meant the black population in Danville and the surrounding region was really a majority of the population pre-Civil War and then after the Civil War. And then Danville became part of a larger story of Southern industrialization in the 1880s and after the Civil War, when the South sought to depart from agriculture solely as a basis of their economic structure, especially with the end of slavery as an economic and social and political system, and looked towards things like textile manufacturing. So stole that from New England and it came south. So Danville really sat at the gateway of the Southern Textile Crescent, which swept from Danville all the way to Birmingham, Alabama. So a lot of this story is unique to the state of Virginia in that it takes part in a larger story that really orients more to the Carolinas and the deeper South. So Danville, known for tobacco, but really became a mill town. This was a city that was run by Dan River Mills. The executives of Dan River Mills often were on city council. There was a vice president of Dan River Mills who was the mayor at one time of Danville. So these things overlapped, civic good, corporate good. These were sort of blurred lines. That's what it means to be a mill town. And there were so-called men at the mill. So these are the guys that sort of have the forces over the entire town, and the community doesn't really have a say. The original men at the mill were 6 men who founded Dan River Mills in 1882, and 3 of those were brothers. They were part of the mercantile class in Danville, brothers James Edward, Robert Addison, and John Harold Schoolfield, which you see over here. And Dan River started in 1882 in downtown Danville with their so-called Riverside Division, and they produced textiles for home and apparel. You'll see some patterns on there, sort of gingham and things like that, and they became known later on, especially for their home department. In 1903, they started their own company town of Schoolfield. Now, Schoolfield was a town that was governed entirely. So Danville, Dan River had its grips on Danville as well, but Schoolfield was entirely run by Dan River Mills. This was a separate division. It was independent of the city of Danville until 1951. So from 1903 until 1951, it was its own village. It had its own electricity, its own sewer system, its own road system. And all the houses were owned by Dan River Mills, all the streets. Dan River Mills also helped with building churches, schools, kindergartens, recreation centers. This was a community built for and by Dan River. All the people who lived here, there were some 5,000 people who lived in Schoolfield, and 840 houses worked at the mill in some way or another. And the more people who were in a family that worked in the mill, the better. So this housing structure really helped Dan River Mills, especially in the early years when they relied on the family labor system. So kids, mothers, and fathers would live there. As you can see, though, this was not a community built so that people could get to know their neighbors. All the streets, the residential streets, the black lines that you see going down from the mill site, those all lead directly to the mill. They do not intersect, right? So you know what your purpose is there. It is to go to work, it is to come back. And at the top of every street also there were little churches. So it was either to go to church and come back, go to work or come back. So the purpose of this town is very clear, even in this planned development, which was very intentional. Important to note, and I'll get back to this in a little bit, was that this was effectively an all-white community because textiles in the South especially were mainly they mainly employed white people only. And in order to live in Schoolfield, you had to work at the mills. So the mill was your landlord. It was your economic source. It really was a benefactor. When I got to Danville in 2010, I was working for the Danville Regional Foundation, which was a hospital conversion foundation there. And I was working there the summer of 2010, and none of this was here. Dan River Mills had left in 2006. Tobacco was on the decline. A lot of the economic sources in Danville had gone. And you could feel the vacuum of power, of money, of people. Between 1990 and 2010, Danville lost about 20% of its population. And you can imagine these big taxpayers, these big corporate taxpayers now being gone. There's no money for cities, or schools, no money for police departments, public services, things like that. And the historic areas in Danville just continued to suffer neglect. And Danville started to be known as a mill town without a mill. This is pictured here is the picture of the white mill. It used to have on top of it this big sign that said Home of Danville River Fabric. So when you're coming into Danville over this river, you see this massive red neon sign that tells you why this place is home and what it's home to. It's home to people who make things. It got hit by a tornado, as you can see in this other picture, I think in 2004, and that really became a symbol of the decline of textiles in Danville and the sort of disinvestment in the community. And nowhere was this more apparent than in Schoolfield itself. I got to know Schoolfield a little more when I was running History United. And this was a company town, and even though it had been annexed by the city of Danville in 1951, and all those little mill houses that had once been rented to mill workers were now owned by mill workers or somebody else, they were privatized. Dan River still had a lot of real estate up there. And you can imagine what happens when a company declares bankruptcy and hightails it out of town. What happens to this swaths of real estate that were once there? And this is what happens, neglect and destruction of a community when its main landlord is gone. This is a recreation center. This is 1916. It had a bowling alley, a swimming pool. It was a YMCA. It was used by the community. It was torn down in 2006 for a CVS. This is Hilton Hall, a 7-story building that was built as a women's dormitory in the early years. 40% of Dan River's workforce were women. It was destroyed by arson in 2012 and had to be torn down. So these are pillars, these are landmarks in this community, and no bigger landmark were the mills themselves. 82-acre mill site, almost completely gone. The bricks were sold off, the lumber was sold off. One Schoolfielder told me that when she looked across at this site, and her parents had worked at the mills, she said it was nothing but a pile of dead bricks. She personified the destruction of the landmarks in her community, and it was an emotional thing for her. Housing, too, became an issue. A lot of these housing got into sort of the wrong hands, derelict landlords, things like that. So it was, the Schoolfield community was losing landmarks, it was losing people, and it was really suffering in the years following Dan River's wake. And so my question in my Virginia Humanities project takes on the question I explored in my dissertation, really, is what happens when these landmarks disappear? What about the history? What will we do, and how will people know about what made this place this place? And especially considering the complicating fact that in the end of this year, Caesars Casino and Resort is being built on the former Schoolfield mill site. So you remember that photo of the mill is in the center of this community with houses all around it. So as new landmarks, very different sorts of places, and this can be seen from all over Danville. You can see this massive hotel going up. That's going to be this big resort with restaurants, conference space, and obviously a casino. How do we capture this history and make sure that this community is remembered and known for what it was? And there are still some remaining landmarks in Schoolfield that can tell the story of Dan River Mills. You have the old company store at the top there, a former kindergarten, that beautiful building right there, 1903 office building where executives officed, a little canteen that used to serve the mills, and then a bank building. So what is the role of history in revitalizing these particular structures? And then another question you have is, okay, so can we use history, and then which history? Even in the midst of Dan River Mills history, you have a corporate history, a history of Dan River Mills as an international corporation with offices in New York and California and Chicago and beyond. I think Bahamian school children wore Dan River Mills fabrics. I mean, there's this massive international story of this corporation. There's a very local story of the community they helped develop in Schoolfield and the life there. And there's also a labor history to this component as well. And then you also say, okay, so there's all these multitudes of stories, but then there's also how people remember Dan River Mills, how they remember this company or growing up in Schoolfield. Pictured here are some of the folks I interviewed: James Buckner, Mae Frances Deering, Linwood Wright, Frank Killian, and Judy Edmonds, who either worked at Dan River or lived in Schoolfield. And flanking them on either side are these pieces from the Schoolfield Preservation Foundation, which is an organization that has saved a lot of the archival and textual material of Dan River Mills and of Schoolfield life. And it's very important not to dismiss their narratives of growing up in Schoolfield or the good and bad memories of working at Dan River. So you have that narrative to contend with. And then you have the archival record, which is, usually in the archives you find a sort of a top-down approach. You have this sort of corporate narrative, this timeline of what Dan River might have thought was important to them. And this fellowship has allowed me to go back into the archive and explore a little bit more what sort of diversity in the archive we can come up with, whether that's economic diversity, racial diversity, and labor, sort of this labor history. So looking at the remembered past, these fond memories, maybe nostalgia, and then bringing it into conversation with the archival record was really a part of this project. Especially when the archival record brings up very dark past of Dan River Mills, especially at its founding. Now, I mentioned before that Danville was known for tobacco, and that tobacco relied on enslaved labor. And then after emancipation and the end of slavery, a lot of that enslaved labor remained, or a lot of the black people who were enslaved remained around the Danville area. And to a lot of white merchants in Danville in the 1880s, that became especially dire, according to them, because Danville was also run by a biracial political coalition known as the Readjuster Party. So there were black men in city council, on the police force, in the marketplace. And this really irked the white merchants who for so long had lived under a racial hierarchy that slavery had helped them enforce. And this is Robert Addison Schoolfield, remember, one of the three Schoolfield brothers who founded Dan River Mills. In his memoir, he explicitly says, "We brought textiles here to Danville to break the, quote, Negro rule." And that is a founding reason. He wanted an industry that would turn away from agriculture, that would turn away from economic opportunity for blacks, and position that for white people only. Also in the archival record, of course, we see his other brother, another founder of Dan River Mills, James Edward Schoolfield, who penned the Danville Circular, which is a very controversial document that incited the Danville riot in 1883, in the days before an election. This Danville Circular, offered sort of a litany of outcries against the Readjuster Party rule and how terrible it was for the community to have this biracial political coalition in charge of so many aspects of political, civic, and social life. This was a public letter, and it incited the Readjusters, of course, and then the Democrats who were in town, and it all came out in the Danville riot, which was a scuffle in the streets that sort of blew up and left over 5 people dead and wounded, and was looked into by the federal government as well as the city of Danville. But here you have one of the founding members of Dan River Mills explicitly working against black rights, black participation in the community. And then you have his brother, Robert Addison Schoolfield, again, helping to suppress the black vote. So in the days following the Danville riot, white men like Robert Addison Schoolfield armed themselves and patrolled the streets of Danville. Robert Addison, in his memoir, said that he patrolled the streets of Danville with a big pistol buckled to his belt and a gun over his shoulder. And this was effectively to say to black Danvillians, you are not to vote in this next election. So the Danville riot happens on November 3rd, 1883. The elections to determine the fate of the Readjuster Party is November 6th, 1883. Robert Addison and his brother effectively destroyed the chance for the Readjuster Party. Danville wouldn't have another black person on city council for at least 100 years, or a mayor. And I don't think this is a coincidence that the demographics show what the founding men at the mill attempted to do. They laid the tracks for a racial hierarchy in Danville that existed as long as Dan River existed in the city of Danville. You see Dan River opens and there's a black majority population in Danville. And that white population starts to go down once Dan River is sued by Julius Adams and a number of other black Dan River workers who were continually pushed to janitorial jobs or were overlooked for supervisory positions or positions with machines that dealt with machines. They sued Dan River for discriminatory hiring practices in 1969. And so you see, as black opportunity rises, the black population rises. And then when Dan River Mills closes in 2006, and as it is today, Danville has a black majority population once again. So the role of industry in shaping a community is I think, it's not a coincidence here that it's shaped the demographics. And that history is apparent in the archives, and we really need to think about that. And we especially need to think about that as the demographics of Danville have changed, and especially in Schoolfield. Schoolfield's now about 60% black. And a lot of people who live there never worked at the mills or don't remember it as a mill town. So how do you present a history about this place that wants to lend a sense of place and community to this area and include the people who live there today? So the project that I'm working on is this public exhibit that seeks to marry the remembered past. So it doesn't seek to elide either the people or the papers that can tell the story of Dan River Mills and Schoolfield. And this is very important as we have new industries and new companies coming into Danville, especially if this massive game changer of a casino coming in, as the demographics of Danville have changed radically. We need to think about how we present this narrative in a way where people can see themselves, where they can reimagine the past for their own future. And so there's a couple steps, I think, that are necessary. And this goes a little bit backwards into my work beyond Virginia Humanities. But the first thing to do is to acknowledge the historicity of Schoolfield. And this has not been acknowledged until 2020, when I worked with the city of Danville and another historic consulting company to designate Schoolfield, to survey it and to designate it as a historic district. So now Schoolfield is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and the Virginia Landmarks Register. Why is that important? important? Well, because it's not just me saying, hey, Schoolfield's important. Schoolfield's history matters. Dan River's history matters to document and to share. It's also, folks in Richmond, the Department of Historic Resources saying, yes, and the National Park Service saying, yes, it is historic. It also incentivizes private developers to use historic tax credits. And historic tax credits allow developers to rehabilitate qualifying historic buildings and receive up to 40% of those rehabilitation costs back to them as historic tax credits. And that's a big incentive, because otherwise these landmarks wouldn't be even discussed. The second step is to engage in the community that's currently there. And this has been part of an ongoing process led by the city of Danville. They've got really great leadership in their city manager, their economic development office, and they hired consultants to do a community-led revitalization plan for the neighborhood, recognizing its importance in Danville's history as well as its future as a casino goes in there. And we really need to think about how we maintain a sense of community even with this new anchor tenant. So we've worked with the city of Danville since 2019 when they hired consultants to do this plan. Now we've got a big fat plan of streetscaping, parks, new buildings, things like that. Great ideas that we got from the community when we held little events. Here's some photos of some events where community was, free giveaways and engaged in what they thought of the community, what they wanted to see in the future. All of that is part of this larger process. And we're continuing those now. Every month we have what's called Schoolfield First Fridays, and I and a group of volunteers run this thing. And it's just really to have fun and to give people a sense that even without a mill, without a central economic driver, we are a community. And this still is made up of nearly 4,000 people, maybe a little bit more than that, and that we need to celebrate that. And we sometimes do fun stuff like we draw on the history of Dan Rivers. Here we have a picture in the center of a textile workshop. A woman came in and taught people how to upcycle their clothes and sort of stitch and do that sort of thing. But we have a lot of fun, and this allows people to see themselves as a community and also brings out people who remember Dan River Schoolfield, and we get to talk to them too. The third step in all of this is revitalizing the remaining landmarks. Remember, I asked that question about what can these be pieces of the puzzle? So it's not thinking about how do we have a museum off in one corner that no one will ever see, but how do we integrate history into every place that was here from the beginning of Schoolfield, that was important to Schoolfield. And these buildings lend themselves to different parts of history. The company store, for instance, is more about the community life, the commercial life of Schoolfield. The welfare building, which used to be the kindergarten and medical center, really an anchor of community life that we can celebrate just growing up in Schoolfield, what people's childhood memories were and that sort of thing. The corporate office of Dan River Mills that was started in 1903, that can tell the corporate story. So we have these different avenues for these things. The canteen, again, more of the workers' story, and the bank, another opportunity for telling the commercial story. And these are all owned by a private developer, I should note, and with plans for revitalization. And we have these fantastic, we've started on these exhibits with sort of outdoor exhibits. On the commercial building, we have this thing that spells out Schoolfield, and we took some old photographs and got them colorized to make them vibrant. So this is a vacant storefront that we've enlivened and brought back with sort of teasers of what the history is of Schoolfield, sort of from the ads that Dan River Mills had to the stores and the pictures of people at work. Bless you. We've also started on looking at how we can build in the history to the interior design. The old office building here, the plans are for that to be a boutique hotel. And so how do we tell the sort of the corporate story when people go in there? What will they know about Dan River, and how do we bring that into the fore? Here's a little inspiration board we are working with the interior designers. And then, thinking about even things like fabrics, how can it draw from the fabrics that Dan River had, draw inspiration from the, that textile history. And then there's objects too from the Schoolfield Preservation Foundation. They've been kind enough to allow me for this project to think about using their material culture and embedding it into the design of these buildings. So that's definitely the plan, and that's what's been so helpful about this fellowship, is really thinking about that critically. Also, you can't just put a bunch of words in an interior design like in a hotel. No one's going to read it. No one might read it here either, but at least it's here. There's a digital component to this where people can go online and learn more about these landmarks and more about the history of Schoolfield. There's also, and I'll show afterwards, this complements something that the city of Danville is helping me with. It's a story map. It's hosted on their website, sort of GIS, and you can explore different landmarks in Schoolfield. And those will be keyed up to a physical sign that has a QR code. So when people are walking around, they see the QR code, it'll take them back to these sites where they can explore a little bit more in depth about the history of these buildings and learn more about the legacy of Dan River Mills as a result. Social media, we do a lot of, I view this as sort of exhibitry. Every week we do another post about the history of Dan River Mills, whether it's a particular building or a collection of them. And Danville is definitely a Facebook town, so it's very helpful to have. I'm not a fan of social media, but it's very helpful to have this sort of component, especially when you want to meet people where they are and you want their reactions to history, or you want them to share their memories. And we found that, especially the Facebook, we're still working on our Instagram, is going pretty well. And the idea with all of this, with this project that's a alternative to sort of a traditional physical exhibit, it's more about embedding history everywhere you are in Schoolfield. It takes the inspiration from another project that History United did in Danville in 2015, which was along with the City of Danville and the Danville Historical Society, to refurbish part of that Home of Dan River fabric sign and place it in the downtown area, just as the home sign. So we're no longer someplace that we make things, but it's less about what we make and why that's our home, but that it is our home, and it's about who we are as a community. And this is what I mean when we draw from history to reimagine our future, and that we don't just elide the entire sign. We don't just put the entire sign away just because it's not relevant anymore. There's part of it that's still relevant, very relevant to who we are today and who we can be in the future. And so what my hope is that this Schoolfield exhibit can similarly be history that's not dusty, gone, or dead, but that's alive, and that's part of the story that we build for ourselves in the future. And that is what I have for you today. And I'm very grateful again for this opportunity to share with you a little bit about my project. And I am honored and pleased to be a Virginia Humanities Fellow this year. And so thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I'll take any questions. Yes?
So are they teaching this in the Danville schools?
That is a great question. The Danville schools is tricky. We've done a lot of work when I was with History United in sort of thinking about plans for this, but I don't think it's in the schools necessarily. And I think it really can be tied to SOL components and things like that. And Dan River's history intertwined with the civil rights history, especially in Danville. I didn't really get to talk about that much, but it would be really neat to be able to think about that as part of the curriculum, yeah. And I hope the physical or the digital component, teachers can sort of take what they want out of there.
This is a little off the wall, but whenever I used to drive through Danville, the first thing I noticed was how I wanted to call the Dan River the Big Muddy.
The Big Muddy, yeah, it is certainly a muddy river.
And I actually talked to someone years ago that told me that textile factory used to actually pollute the river.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The environmental history of Dan River is also another history you could tell. It's wild. I mean, I remember one nonprofit head was like, "Oh, for St. Patrick's Day, let's dye the Dan River green," and everyone's like, "No, don't do it," because it used to be that Dan River would dye it whatever color they were dyeing that day. So it's like, "Oh, it's blue jeans today," and the whole river's blue. So it's that's another history that's yet to be told. Yeah. Well, I'll show you guys this little, so just so you can see the story map, but this is a fun component too. And what I like about it is that it's the city's website, so, if I, stop hosting something, that this will be around. And they have this fun map of Schoolfield in 1942, and you can sort of see what it was like. And these are the landmarks that we talk about in the story map, and you can compare them to what's there today, which is a big construction site for Caesars. But you can still see those smokestacks and the surrounding buildings. So we're looking forward to, and this is not live, but it will be. But so what's fun about going back into the archive is that you can get all these photos and things like that, and you can share them. And that's what's great about the internet too, is you just put up all these photos and get people's reactions, and it's a really great way to share history.
So these are the houses
Mm-hmm. These are the larger houses. So the typology are usually 2-room, 3-room, 4-room. These were 7-room houses. These are where sort of like clerical staff lived and things like that. And these are right at the entrance of the village. But they do. Most of the housing still exists. See, here's a present day photo. I try to put those in to make sure people know. And then, like these houses still exist. They're wildly expensive if you look them up on Zillow. But, these are some of the more different housing that they had here. And then this is the majority of housing types were these. And you see these. I mean, there's over 800 of these in the village, of these sort of different typologies. Yes?
I think one of the concerns would be having seen what happened in other cities where there were casinos, and those houses are now expensive. They
Right.
didn't used to be, and so the people who used to own those houses, the casinos are going to push them out.
Yeah.
That's a concern.
That is absolutely a concern of ours, and we want to use history as sort of a touch point to get people involved with this community. And we're starting a community council in tandem with the Danville Regional Foundation so that the community feels like a community first and foremost, and then they feel like they have a voice in what happens to these houses. And I think that's really important. We don't want people displaced. We want people, and I think the city of Danville is also very committed to that, to keeping people where they are and helping them renovate their house if that's what they need to do. But yeah, that's definitely everyone's concern. And we want to be the example of a community where the casino has been successful, and so is the community surrounding it. Yeah. Yeah.
So in the economy now, you can justify a casino in Danville.
Oh, Danville is going great guns. I mean, Danville has had a massive economic resurgence that I could never have imagined when I went there in 2010, when I first started working there. The City Economic Development Department has brought in an amazing number of diverse industries, including one called Cirque, that recycles old fabrics and turns them into just the threads, and so takes old clothes and gives them a new life. So bringing that textile history back, super neat. There's a lot of precision machining. There's submarine manufacturing. It's wild what there is in Danville. And so the Caesars is really just an investment in what was already going on, this economic resurgence that was really due to a proactive city government.
Isn't there also right on the North Carolina border?
Yes. Oh yeah, especially for the casino. But there's also, the Raleigh-Durham area. All those folks can come up that way, and it's a real boon for Danville, definitely. Yes.
The process of this project. So it seems like it required a lot of partnerships.
Yes.
Between the boutique hotels, the city with the GIS infrastructure, identifying individuals to interview. Any particular challenges in building these partnerships or relationships?
Yes, I mean, and like I said, all these narratives are valid. All these narratives, the remembered past, the archival past, and how people want to see the future. The city in and of itself is very future-oriented. The community itself very present-oriented. And then the folks who grew up in Schoolfield back in the day, very past-oriented. So how do you merge all of these and make sure you're getting every part of this story, past, present, and future, in a robust way? Yeah, that's a difficult balance there, because the people who are looking forward are like, do we really want to talk about, this racial legacy? And even present people are, it's a tough thing to discuss. But I think it's important to contemplate, because you don't know your home until you have learned about it, and you can't love a place where you live until you really know its history. So I think it's a critical component of that. So I've tried to balance all that, but yeah, it is, and it's got its challenges, but it's, I think, critically important. Yes.
I think when I heard the piece on CERP on NPR, they were going to be operating out of a former Danville Mills building.
If they said that, that's amazing. I don't know anything about that, but that it would be really neat.
Dan River in the town, not Dan River, the manufacturing plant.
Yeah, but the white mill where the Home and Dan River Fabric sign that's going up, there's a lot of, commercial area that's going in there, and city services and things like that. And that's really a symbol of Danville's resurgence too, more so, I would say, than the casino, because this massive white mill that you see when you're coming into town really speaks to the idea that Danville's back, and it's back with something different. Yeah.
Have you spoken to any of the descendants of the women who lived in that dormitory that you showed?
I wish I could. It stopped being a dormitory around 1928. So but it became offices. And so many people worked in those offices and remembered Hilton Hall as sort of their place at Dan River, in a sales office, things like that.
You know of other places where women were recruited from Appalachia?
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what happened in Danville. A lot of Schoolfielders you talk to, they say, well, my parents were from Stewart or things like that, and that's where they got, there weren't enough white people for these jobs in Danville to begin with, so they had to recruit from Appalachia and rural farms, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
So you talk a lot about not allowing people's histories to value
Mm-hmm.
validity of people's histories. This is so much community-based, I think, effort, right? So to tell me that, how do you hold there are many things, but how do you hold at least the two things of making people feel a sense of maybe pride in their history, while also recognizing things that folks might find more painful?
Right.
How do you tell that together? Like thinking about the hotel, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
You're telling that corporate history. What does that corporate history actually look like? And within that community engaged sort of telling. It's fascinating. It seems to be a fascinating challenge.
Yeah, it is. And I think the way you do it might be more art than history. But thinking about, like if you're having a portrait if you want to talk about the founding Dan River fathers, and you put their portraits up, but then behind the portraits you might have their memoirs where they're telling you exactly why they started the mills. And so you have context for their, them as men. They did a great thing by creating an economic driver in Danville, but they also shaped Danville in a sort of maybe an unforgivable way, and so helping to show both of that. But then, of course, there's also instances in the 1960s when Danville civil rights was at its peak in 1963, the summer of 1963. One of Dan River's management wrote to the judge who was not giving bail to these civil rights protesters. And he said, you're being way too harsh. And he got like 3 days at the city prison farm for that, and so there's these different stories of management stepping up. There's different stories of management, being very clear about that they're doing this for a racial hierarchy. So, I think telling those stories and building it into a narrative so that it's not only a narrative about Danville or Dan River's racial history, but it is a narrative about a multitude of people over time. Yeah, it's not just one thing. Right. Yes?
I have a friend who's an old guy like me. His father had been the president of a small college in the town, and I sort of have a general understanding from some of his comments that this college has been folded into a larger university today, or in present time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything
Yeah, there's
about
Averett and
that?
there's Stratford and there's DCC, but I don't know about Averett being folded in to anything. They're still a little liberal arts college in the town.
Have they been involved at all in this effort?
They were involved in the 1980s and through a Virginia Humanities grant to record oral histories of Schoolfield, people who worked at Dan River Mills. But of course, they did not interview, I don't think, a single black person for that. And that also is compounded by the fact that the Southern Oral History program down at UNC also did a similar oral history collection in the 1970s. And there weren't many black voices there either. So that's another part of all of that we'll need to fix. But it's time is running out as well for that. Okay, well, thank you all.
So do you live in Danville?
I do, I live there.